when his desperate attempt to understand the strange occurrences on his newly inherited Civil War battlefield property led him to sweep the historic grounds with a metal detector. 34-year-old former Army Sergeant Maxwell Fletcher uncovered a hidden underground bunker containing $80 million in Confederate gold bars meant for funding the South's final military campaign, proving that sometimes the most painful inheritances conceal the most extraordinary rewards. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Willow Creek Battlefield stretched across 180 acres of rolling Virginia countryside, its peaceful meadows and gentle hills bearing little evidence of the bloody conflict that had once raged across this land. Located about 40 miles southwest of Richmond, in the heart of what had once been Confederate territory, the property encompassed what historians considered a minor but significant Civil War battle site, where Union and Confederate forces had clashed in a fierce but forgotten engagement during the war's final months. On clear mornings, which came frequently in this part of Virginia during the spring and fall, you could see all the way to the Blue Ridge Mountains, their ancient slopes rising like sentinels in the distance. The battlefield wasn't the largest in Virginia. That distinction belonged to better-known sites like Gettysburg and Antietam, but Willow Creek held historical significance that belied its modest size and relative obscurity. What made Willow Creek truly special, however, wasn't just its historical importance, but its connection to Maxwell Fletcher's family. The Fletcher family story began in 1862, when Maxwell's great-grandfather, Lieutenant Samuel Fletcher, had fought and died on this very land while serving with the Union Army. Family legend held that Samuel had written home about the battle's strategic importance, claiming that what happens at Willow Creek may determine the very course of this terrible war. For generations, the Fletcher family had maintained a connection to this battlefield, visiting on Memorial Days and contributing to local historical preservation efforts. But never in their wildest dreams had they imagined that the land itself would one day come into their possession. That unexpected development had occurred just 6 months earlier, when Maxwell's uncle William, a childless history professor who had purchased the battlefield 20 years ago to prevent its development, had died suddenly, leaving the entire property to his only nephew. The inheritance had come at a pivotal moment in Maxwell Fletcher's life. At 34, he had recently completed his third and final tour of duty with the Army, serving as a sergeant in Afghanistan. His military service had left him with both visible and invisible scars, a pronounced limp from a shrapnel wound in his left leg, and the haunting memories of combat that followed him into civilian life. Struggling to find steady employment and purpose after his discharge, Maxwell had been on the verge of financial ruin when his uncle's attorney had called with news of the inheritance. Maxwell stood 5 feet 11 inches with the lean, sinewy build that came from years of military training and deployment. His hands told the story of his life, calloused from handling weapons and equipment, scarred from both battlefield injuries and the construction work he had taken on to make ends meet after leaving the service. At 34, his dark hair had begun graying at the temples, and deep lines around his eyes spoke of someone who had seen far too much for someone so young. The modest farmhouse that came with the battlefield property had been built in the 1920s and renovated by his uncle in the early 2000s. It sat on a small rise that provided views across the historic landscape, its wraparound porch offering the perfect vantage point for appreciating both sunrise and sunset over the rolling Virginia countryside. Inside, the house reflected his uncle's academic background. Bookshelves lined every available wall space, filled with historical volumes about the Civil War, local history, and military strategy. Maxwell's transition from combat veteran to battlefield caretaker had not been easy. The property came with responsibilities he had never anticipated: maintenance of the historic site, interaction with the occasional tourists and history buffs, who visited Willow Creek, and coordination with local historical societies that had long partnered with his uncle on preservation efforts. More challenging still was the property's financial situation. While his uncle had left enough money to cover taxes and basic maintenance for about a year, the battlefield generated almost no income and required constant work to maintain. In the first few months after inheriting Willow Creek, Maxwell had thrown himself into learning everything he could about the property and its history. He had spent countless hours reading his uncle's extensive collection of books about the Civil War, studying maps of the battle that had occurred on the property, and exploring every acre of the land on foot. This immersion in history had provided a welcome distraction from his own struggles with post-traumatic stress and his uncertain financial future. The local community of Carterville, Virginia, population 2,763, had welcomed Maxwell with the cautious friendliness typical of small southern towns. The residents respected his military service and appreciated his connection to the beloved Professor William Fletcher, but they also watched with curiosity to see how this combat veteran would handle the responsibility of preserving an important piece of local history. Every Thursday morning, Maxwell joined an informal gathering of local history enthusiasts at Ruby's Diner on Main Street. The group, which had been meeting for decades, included several people who had worked closely with his uncle on various historical projects. There was Robert Daniels, a retired high school history teacher whose grandfather had been one of the first to document the Battle of Willow Creek in a self-published book back in 1923. Eleanor Whitfield, the 72-year-old director of the county historical society, possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of every significant event that had occurred within 50 miles of Carterville since the founding of the nation. Thomas Green, at 38, was the youngest regular member of the group before Maxwell's arrival. As the curator of the small Carterville Civil War Museum, he brought professional expertise to the informal gatherings and had been especially helpful in explaining the historical significance of various features of the Willow Creek property. And finally, there was Harold Jenkins, an 85-year-old whose family had lived in the area since before the Civil War and who claimed to have heard stories about Willow Creek passed down through 5 generations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. These weekly gatherings had become an important part of Maxwell's adaptation to civilian life and his new role as caretaker of a historical site. The conversation ranged from scholarly debates about military tactics to local gossip about which historical sites were receiving grant funding, but it always returned to the enduring fascination with the Civil War that united this diverse group. The thing you have to understand about Willow Creek, Eleanor had explained during one of Maxwell's first meetings with the group, is that it's historically significant not just for what we know happened there, but for what we don't know. There are still so many unanswered questions about that battle and its aftermath. Those unanswered questions had become increasingly fascinating to Maxwell as he settled into his new home and role. According to the official historical record, the Battle of Willow Creek had occurred in February 1865. Just 2 months before Lee's surrender at Appomattox would end the Civil War, the engagement had involved approximately 3,000 Confederate troops attempting to secure a strategic railway junction against a Union force of similar size. After a day of fierce fighting that resulted in several hundred casualties on both sides, the Union forces had prevailed, further weakening the already crumbling Confederate military position in Virginia. What made Willow Creek particularly interesting to historians, however, was evidence suggesting that the Confederate force had been accompanied by a significant shipment of gold intended to fund continued resistance. Records indicated that this gold had never reached its destination, and its fate remained one of the many small mysteries of the Civil War's chaotic final months. Maxwell's uncle had been particularly interested in this aspect of Willow Creek's history, collecting every scrap of information about the missing Confederate gold in a meticulously organized file cabinet in his study. The file contained copies of military dispatches, newspaper articles from 1865, letters from soldiers who had participated in the battle, and even a hand-drawn map that purported to show the route taken by the wagon carrying the gold shipment. While most historians, including the members of the Thursday morning group at Ruby's Diner, considered the lost gold to be an interesting historical footnote rather than a realistic prospect for discovery, Maxwell found himself increasingly intrigued by the possibility that his property might hold secrets that had remained hidden for over 150 years. His military training had taught him to be methodical and observant, and he began applying these skills to a systematic exploration of the battlefield. Armed with metal detectors, historical maps, and the knowledge gleaned from his uncle's extensive research, Maxwell spent his days walking carefully planned search patterns across the property, documenting every artifact he discovered: many balls, uniform buttons, belt buckles, and the other detritus of battle that still emerged from the soil after all these years. This work was not just a treasure hunt but a form of therapy. The focused attention required for careful searching provided relief from the intrusive memories of combat that still plagued him, and each historical artifact he discovered created a tangible connection to the soldiers who had fought and died on this land, including his own ancestor. For a man struggling to find purpose after the structured environment of military service, the systematic exploration of Willow Creek offered both meaningful work and a sense of connection to something larger than himself. Maxwell's financial situation, however, continued to deteriorate. The modest savings he had accumulated during his military service were rapidly dwindling, and the part-time work he had managed to find at a local hardware store barely covered his basic living expenses. The property taxes on 180 acres, even with the preferential rate applied to historical sites, represented a looming financial burden that he had no clear way to address. By September, 8 months after inheriting Willow Creek, Maxwell was facing the very real possibility that he might have to sell the property. The thought of parting with this connection to his family history and the work he had poured into understanding and preserving the battlefield filled him with a sense of impending loss that rivaled the grief he had experienced for fallen comrades. It was during this period of financial anxiety and impending decision that Maxwell began to notice something strange about the southeastern corner of the property. The area, approximately 15 acres of gently sloping ground bordered by a small creek, had always been considered a relatively insignificant part of the battlefield. Historical records indicated that it had been far from the main engagement, serving primarily as a staging area for Confederate artillery that had never actually been deployed in the fighting. What caught Maxwell's attention was the behavior of the local wildlife in this particular section of the property. Deer, which were abundant throughout Willow Creek and could typically be seen grazing in the early morning and late evening hours, completely avoided this one area. Similarly, the groundhogs that had built extensive burrow systems across the battlefield were noticeably absent from this corner of the property, despite the favorable terrain and abundant vegetation. At first, Maxwell attributed this anomaly to some natural explanation, perhaps a difference in soil composition or vegetation that made the area less attractive to wildlife. But as he paid closer attention, he noticed other peculiarities. The grass grew differently here, slightly sparser, and with a subtly different color than in the surrounding areas. After heavy rains, the ground in this section dried more quickly than elsewhere on the property, suggesting differences in drainage or subsurface conditions. Maxwell's military experience had made him particularly attuned to unusual patterns in familiar environments. In Afghanistan, noticing subtle changes in the landscape or the behavior of local people had sometimes been the difference between life and death. Now those same observational skills were drawing his attention to a mystery much closer to home. During the next Thursday gathering at Ruby's Diner, Maxwell mentioned his observations to the history group. "Have any of you ever noticed anything strange about the southeastern corner of Willow Creek? The wildlife seems to avoid it completely." Harold Jenkins, the eldest member of the group, looked up from his coffee with sudden interest. "My grandfather used to talk about that very spot," he said slowly. "Called it the dead zone. Said nothing would grow right there after the battle. Most folks figured it was just an old man's tale, but he swore there was something unnatural about that ground." Eleanor Whitfield nodded thoughtfully. "William, your uncle, was interested in that area too. He had some soil samples analyzed about 10 years ago, thinking there might be contamination from artillery shells or something similar. But the tests came back normal, nothing that would explain why animals avoid it." Thomas Green, the museum curator, added another piece to the puzzle. "There's an interesting note in the Confederate quartermaster's records about that section of the property. Apparently, they designated it for special storage in the days before the battle. No details about what was stored there, but it was marked as restricted access, officers only." This information transformed Maxwell's casual observation into a compelling historical mystery. If the Confederate forces had used that area for special storage, and wildlife still avoided it 150 years later, perhaps there was something significant buried beneath the seemingly unremarkable stretch of ground. The next day, Maxwell began a more focused investigation of the southeastern corner. Armed with his most sensitive metal detector and a systematic search pattern, he spent the entire day slowly walking back and forth across the area, marking any significant readings with small flags. By sunset, he had identified several spots that produced strong signals, suggesting the presence of substantial metal objects beneath the surface. Without the equipment or expertise needed for a proper archaeological excavation, Maxwell knew he needed professional assistance to proceed. But professional archaeological services were expensive, and his financial situation was already precarious. Moreover, involving outside experts would inevitably mean surrendering some control over whatever might be discovered on his property. After several days of consideration, Maxwell decided to take a calculated risk. Using equipment borrowed from Thomas Green at the museum, he would conduct a limited excavation at the site with the strongest metal detector reading, careful to document everything according to proper archaeological protocols. If he found something significant, he could then seek professional assistance for a more extensive investigation. On a crisp October morning, with the trees surrounding Willow Creek blazing with autumn colors, Maxwell began carefully removing the topsoil from a 3-foot square area. Where his metal detector had registered its strongest signal, he worked slowly and methodically, scraping away thin layers of soil with a trowel and sifting each bucketful through a screen to catch any small artifacts. This painstaking process continued for hours, revealing nothing but the occasional rusty nail or fragment of metal debris. Just as the afternoon sun began to sink toward the horizon, Maxwell's trowel struck something solid approximately 2 feet below the surface. Carefully brushing away the surrounding soil, he uncovered what appeared to be a flat metal plate about 18 inches square. Unlike the other metal objects he had found scattered across the battlefield, this plate showed remarkably little corrosion, suggesting it was made of a more durable material or had been better protected from the elements. As he continued to clear soil from around the edges of the metal plate, Maxwell realized that it was not a random piece of debris but part of a deliberately constructed feature, what appeared to be the top of a small hatch or access point. The plate was attached to a metal frame embedded in a concrete structure that extended deeper into the ground. Maxwell's heart raced as he contemplated the implications of this discovery. The southeastern corner of Willow Creek Battlefield, long dismissed as an insignificant staging area, might conceal an underground structure dating back to the Civil War, perhaps the special storage facility mentioned in the Confederate records. And if the quartermaster's records were accurate, this facility might have been used to store something of significant value, Possibly even the missing gold shipment that had fascinated historians for generations. The fading daylight forced Maxwell to suspend his excavation, but his mind continued to race with possibilities as he walked back to the farmhouse. If he had indeed discovered an underground Confederate storage facility, the historical significance would be enormous. The contents, whether military supplies, documents, or the legendary gold shipment, would transform understanding of the Battle of Willow Creek and possibly even broader aspects of the Civil War's final months. That evening, Maxwell called Thomas Green to share news of his discovery. The museum curator's excitement was palpable even over the phone. "Max, if you've found what I think you've found, this could be one of the most significant Civil War discoveries in decades," Thomas said. "But we need to proceed carefully. Whatever's down there has been preserved for over 150 years, and improper excavation could damage invaluable historical artifacts." Thomas agreed to visit the site the next morning, bringing photographic equipment and additional archaeological tools from the museum. He also suggested contacting Dr. Eliza Montgomery, an archaeologist at the University of Virginia who specialized in Civil War sites and had worked with Maxwell's uncle on several previous projects. Maxwell spent a restless night, his imagination filled with visions of what might lie beneath the metal hatch. The tension in the underground chamber was palpable as Hoffman methodically turned the dial, pausing frequently to listen through his stethoscope. After nearly 40 minutes of this painstaking process, he looked up with a smile of satisfaction. "I believe we've got it," he said, reaching for the handle. The heavy door swung open with a low groan of metal that had remained motionless for over 150 years, revealing a sight that exceeded everyone's expectations. Inside the safe, stacked in neat rows, were wooden boxes stamped with the Confederate Treasury seal. Each box was approximately 12 inches long, 8 inches wide, and 4 inches deep, the standard dimensions for Civil War-era gold transport containers. Dr. Montgomery stepped forward, donning cotton conservation gloves before carefully lifting the top box from the stack. With deliberate movements, she placed it on a prepared table and gently opened the lid. Inside, nestled in protective cotton batting that had yellowed with age but remained intact, were 5 gold bars, each stamped with the Confederate States of America seal and serial numbers. "These appear to be standard Confederate Treasury gold bars," she said, her professional tone barely concealing her excitement. "Each would weigh approximately 1 pound, making them worth about $30,000 at current gold prices, but their historical value is incalculable." A quick count revealed 24 boxes of identical size in the safe, along with several document pouches sealed with wax treasury stamps. If each box contained 5 one-pound gold bars, the total would be 120 pounds of gold worth approximately $3, $6 million for the metal alone, with a much higher value to collectors and museums. But the safe contained only a portion of what the team could now see in the underground chamber. Along the walls stood stacks of larger wooden crates, their Confederate treasury markings indicating additional gold and silver stores. As Dr. Montgomery directed the careful removal and documentation of each container from the safe, Maxwell struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what they had discovered. "This isn't just a small emergency fund," Thomas Green whispered, his historian's mind already calculating the implications. "This appears to be a major Confederate Treasury shipment, possibly one of the last attempts to move government funds before Richmond fell." The documentation process continued for hours as each box was carefully removed, opened, photographed, and its contents recorded. In addition to the gold bars, they discovered silver coins, Confederate currency that had never entered circulation, and several leather-bound ledgers recording Treasury transactions from the war's final months. By late afternoon, the initial inventory was complete enough to establish the scale of the discovery. The underground chamber contained approximately 2,800 pounds of gold in various forms and 4,200 pounds of silver, along with currency and financial documents of enormous historical significance. At current precious metal prices, the gold alone would be worth nearly $80 million, with the silver adding several million more. The historical significance potentially exceeded even the monetary value. The documents included confidential Confederate government communications about last-ditch financial strategies, plans for continuing resistance after Richmond's fall, and records of foreign financial arrangements that had never been discovered by Union forces or subsequent historians. As the team prepared to secure the site for the night, Dr. Montgomery pulled Maxwell aside for a private conversation. "Mr. Fletcher, you need to understand the magnitude of what we found here," she said, her expression serious. "This isn't just a matter of historical interest anymore. We're talking about a discovery worth tens of millions of dollars on your property. Things are about to become very complicated." Dr. Montgomery explained that while the discovery had occurred on Maxwell's private property, various laws and regulations regarding historical artifacts, particularly those related to the Confederacy, could affect his ownership rights. The state of Virginia, the federal government, and possibly even descendants of the original Confederate Treasury officials might make claims on the contents of the underground chamber. "I'm not trying to alarm you," she continued, "but you need legal representation immediately, someone who specializes in historical artifacts and treasure laws. This situation will move very quickly once news gets out, and you need to be prepared." Maxwell nodded, the reality of his situation beginning to sink in. "Can you recommend someone?" he asked. Dr. Montgomery provided the name of Catherine Lawson, an attorney in Richmond who specialized in archaeological finds and historical property rights. "She worked with your uncle on several projects," the archaeologist explained. "She understands the intersection of history, archaeology, and property law better than anyone I know." That evening, after the site had been secured with professional guards hired by the university, Maxwell returned to the farmhouse and called Catherine Lawson. The attorney listened carefully to his description of the discovery, asking pointed questions about the documentation process and who had been present. When the safe was opened, "You've done everything right so far," she said when he had finished. "Working with qualified archaeologists and following proper protocols will strengthen your position enormously. I'll drive down tomorrow morning to assess the situation firsthand and begin preparing for what's coming." Sleep eluded Maxwell for the second night in a row. He sat on the farmhouse porch until well past midnight, trying to process the day's events and their implications for his future. The battlefield that had seemed a financial burden just days earlier now contained a fortune that could transform his life if he could establish legal claim to even a portion of it. More profound than the financial implications was the connection to history that the discovery represented. His great-grandfather had fought and died on this land during the very battle that had prevented this Confederate gold from reaching its destination. Now, more than 150 years later, his descendant had uncovered the treasure that had been hidden beneath the battlefield all this time. The historical symmetry seemed almost too perfect to be coincidental. By morning, despite Dr. Montgomery's efforts to maintain confidentiality, news of the discovery had spread. Local television crews arrived at the property gate, and Maxwell's phone rang continuously with calls from reporters seeking confirmation of rumors about the Willow Creek gold. The university arranged for additional security personnel to protect the excavation site, but it was clear that the quiet phase of the investigation was over. Catherine Lawson arrived mid-morning, navigating past the growing media presence with the confidence of someone accustomed to high-profile cases. In her mid-50s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, despite the rural setting, she projected an authority that immediately put Maxwell at ease. "First things first," she said after introducing herself. "We need to document everything meticulously and establish the clearest possible chain of custody. Then we need to file the appropriate notifications with state and federal authorities before they come to us. Being proactive rather than reactive will be crucial. Catherine's assessment of the legal situation was both encouraging and sobering. Virginia law generally recognized that artifacts discovered on private property belonged to the landowner, but federal regulations regarding historically significant finds could complicate matters. The Confederate connection added another layer of complexity, as items related to the Confederacy often triggered specific historical preservation requirements. "The good news," she explained as they walked the property perimeter, away from the excavation site and potential eavesdroppers, "is that you've handled everything perfectly so far. You brought in qualified experts, followed proper archaeological protocols, and haven't attempted to remove or conceal anything. That gives us a strong foundation." Catherine recommended filing formal notices with the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, the United States Treasury Department, and several other agencies documenting the discovery and Maxwell's role as the property owner. She also suggested establishing a cooperative relationship with the Virginia Historical Society and the Smithsonian Institution, potentially allowing some artifacts to be displayed while maintaining Maxwell's ownership claims. The worst approach would be appearing to hoard this discovery for personal gain, she advised. The best strategy is positioning yourself as a responsible steward of history who happens to have legal ownership rights. That makes it much harder for government agencies to justify aggressive intervention. By afternoon, Catherine had drafted the initial legal notifications and begun discussions with officials at several museums about potential partnership arrangements. Her rapid response and strategic approach made Maxwell deeply grateful for Dr. Montgomery's recommendation. Meanwhile, the archaeological team continued their careful documentation of the underground chamber's contents. Each item was photographed, in place, assigned a catalog number, and recorded in a database that would serve both archaeological and legal purposes. The process was slow and meticulous, but essential for maintaining the historical integrity of the find. "My grandfather would never have believed it," Harold told a reporter from the Richmond Times-Dispatch. "He knew there was something strange about that piece of ground, but even in his wildest imaginings, I don't think he ever suspected Confederate gold." Eleanor Whitfield, as director of the County Historical Society, found herself suddenly managing offers from major museums interested in creating exhibits about Willow Creek and its newly discovered significance. "We've gone from being a footnote in Civil War history books to potentially having one of the most important sites for understanding the Confederacy's final days," she explained to Maxwell during a rare quiet moment between media interviews. Thomas Green, whose museum expertise had proven invaluable during the excavation, was already developing plans for a permanent exhibition that would tell the complete story of the Battle of Willow Creek, the hidden treasury shipment, and its discovery after more than 150 years. "This isn't just about the gold," he insisted whenever reporters focused too narrowly on the monetary value. "It's about filling a significant gap in our historical understanding of how the Confederate leadership responded to impending defeat." For Maxwell, the personal implications of the discovery continued to evolve alongside the archaeological and legal developments. The financial potential remained uncertain, contingent on the outcome of what promised to be complex legal proceedings. But something more important had already occurred. He had found purpose and meaning in his role as caretaker of this historical land. For the first time since leaving the military, Maxwell felt that his actions had significant impact. The discipline and attention to detail he had developed as a soldier had led directly to this discovery, proving that the skills he had sometimes feared might be irrelevant in civilian life were in fact uniquely valuable in the right context. The discovery had also transformed his relationship with his family history. His great-great-grandfather's service and sacrifice at Willow Creek now connected directly to Maxwell's own role in revealing what had remained hidden since that battle. The symmetry across generations provided a sense of continuity and purpose that transcended the potential financial windfall. On the 5th day of excavation, as the archaeological team neared completion of their initial documentation, Dr. Montgomery approached Maxwell with news that added yet another dimension to the already remarkable discovery. "We've been analyzing the military documents found among the treasury papers," she explained, "and we've identified something I think you'll find personally significant." She handed Maxwell a brittle yellowed page protected in a clear conservation sleeve. It was a Union Army field report dated February 17, 1865, the day of the Battle of Willow Creek, listing casualties and commendations. Halfway down the page, a name leapt out: Lieutenant Samuel Fletcher, 118th Pennsylvania Volunteers, killed while leading a charge against Confederate artillery positions. Recommended for posthumous commendation for valor above and beyond the call of duty. "Your ancestor wasn't just present at the battle," Dr. Montgomery said quietly. "According to these records, he was directly responsible for the Union victory. That prevented this gold from reaching its destination. His actions that day are why this treasure remained hidden until you found it 158 years later." The connection was so perfect, so poetically just, that Maxwell found himself momentarily speechless. His ancestor had given his life to win a battle that kept Confederate gold from supporting continued resistance. And now Maxwell had uncovered that same gold, creating the possibility of financial security for himself and a significant contribution to historical understanding. "There's more," Dr. Montgomery continued, producing another document. "This is a map drawn by a Confederate quartermaster, showing the planned route for the gold shipment after it left Willow Creek. If Lieutenant Fletcher hadn't led that charge when he did, this gold would have been moved within hours to another location, entirely possibly one that would never have been discovered." The personal connection to the discovery deepened Maxwell's resolve to ensure that its historical significance would be properly honored, regardless of the legal outcome regarding ownership. Whatever financial benefit might eventually come his way, he now understood that his primary responsibility was as a steward of history, his family's history, Virginia's history, and the nation's history. That evening, Catherine Lawson returned from Richmond with updates on the legal front. The Virginia Department of Historic Resources had formally recognized the discovery's exceptional significance and initiated the process for designating Willow Creek Battlefield as a site of special historical importance, a designation that would provide certain tax benefits and preservation resources, but would also place limitations on how the property could be used in the future. More significantly, Catherine had received the United States Treasury Department's formal position regarding the Confederate gold. While maintaining that the federal government had potential claims on the assets, they had proposed a compromise approach, a partnership between federal agencies, the state of Virginia, and Maxwell as the property owner to preserve the historical integrity of the find while fairly addressing the ownership question. "It's a starting point for negotiations," Catherine explained, "not a final resolution. But the fact that they're proposing a partnership rather than simply asserting federal ownership is a positive sign. They recognize the complexity of the situation and your legitimate role in the discovery. The proposed partnership would establish a formal process for evaluating each item recovered from the underground chamber, with different arrangements potentially applying to different categories: the gold and silver, the Confederate currency, the military documents, and the treasury. Communications. Some items might ultimately be determined to be Maxwell's property, while others might be designated for museum display, with Maxwell receiving recognition and certain financial considerations. "We'll need to negotiate carefully," Catherine advised. "But this approach gives us a framework that acknowledges your rights while also recognizing the legitimate public interest in such a significant historical discovery." Maxwell nodded, beginning to see a path forward that balanced personal benefit with historical responsibility. As long as my role in the discovery is recognized and I have some financial outcome that lets me maintain the property, I'm open to arrangements that make sure everything is properly preserved and studied. As the initial phase of excavation and documentation neared completion, Maxwell found himself at the center of what had become not just a treasure discovery, but a historical reconsideration of the Civil War's final months. Scholars from major universities were arriving daily to examine the documents recovered from the underground chamber, each finding pieces of information that challenged or expanded previous understanding of this critical period in American history. Through it all, Maxwell maintained the quiet dignity and careful attention to detail that had characterized his military service. He attended every briefing, reviewed all documentation procedures, and worked closely with the security team to ensure that nothing was removed from the site without proper authorization and recording. His discipline and methodical approach earned respect from the professional archaeologists and historians, many of whom had initially viewed him simply as the fortunate property owner rather than an active participant in the historical investigation. Gradually, they came to recognize that Maxwell's military training and personal connection to the battlefield made him an essential partner in understanding and preserving this unexpected window into the past. The morning of the 6th day dawned with golden sunlight washing over Willow Creek Battlefield, creating an almost ethereal glow across the historic landscape. Maxwell Fletcher stood on the farmhouse porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the growing crowd of officials, archaeologists, and media representatives gathering near the excavation site. In just 1 week, his life had transformed from that of a struggling veteran facing financial ruin to the center of what many were calling the most significant Civil War discovery of the century. Catherine Lawson arrived early, dressed for what promised to be a pivotal day of negotiations. Representatives from the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, the United States Treasury Department, the Smithsonian Institution, and several other agencies were scheduled for a formal meeting to discuss the future of the Willow Creek gold and its associated historical artifacts. Today we establish the framework for everything that follows, Catherine explained as they walked toward the meeting tent that had been set up near the excavation site. Stay focused on our 3 core principles: recognition of your property rights, acknowledgement of your role in the discovery, and a balanced approach to preservation and access. The negotiation session lasted nearly 6 hours, with passionate arguments about historical preservation, legal precedents regarding discovered treasure, and the public interest in such a significant find. Maxwell, guided by Catherine's expertise, maintained a position that balanced respect for history with recognition of his legal rights as the property owner. "My great-great-grandfather gave his life on this battlefield," Maxwell stated during a particularly intense exchange with federal officials. "I don't view this discovery as a lottery ticket, but as a responsibility to honor that sacrifice and ensure this history is preserved. At the same time, I need to secure the future of this property that's been entrusted to me." By late afternoon, a preliminary framework agreement had emerged. The gold and silver would be professionally valued, with Maxwell receiving 45% of the appraised value, approximately $36 million, based on current estimates. The historical documents would remain together as a collection, with Maxwell retaining ownership but agreeing to long-term loan arrangements with the Smithsonian and other major institutions to ensure proper preservation and public access. Most significantly, Willow Creek Battlefield would be designated as a National Historic Landmark, with funding provided for its preservation and development as an educational site. Maxwell would retain ownership of the property and serve as its director, with his personal connection to both the battlefields, history, and its remarkable discovery becoming part of the site's historical narrative. "It's a solid outcome," Catherine told him as they reviewed the terms after the meeting. You'll have the financial security to maintain the property indefinitely, recognition of your role in this historic discovery, and the resources to transform Willow Creek into the significant historical site it deserves to be. The following weeks brought a whirlwind of activity as the agreement moved from preliminary framework to formal legal documents. Teams of experts continued the painstaking work of documenting, preserving, and studying the contents of the underground chamber. Each gold bar was carefully cataloged, each document preserved with advanced conservation techniques, and each aspect of the discovery recorded for both historical research and the legal record. Dr. Montgomery's team had completed a comprehensive archaeological report establishing that the underground chamber had been constructed in January 1865, just weeks before the Battle of Willow Creek. The construction techniques matched those used for other Confederate military installations from the war's final months, suggesting that the facility had been built by specialized engineering units working directly under Treasury Department authority. What makes this site particularly remarkable, Dr. Montgomery explained during a briefing attended by museum curators from around the country, is the evidence of long-term planning. This wasn't a hasty effort to hide valuables before a battle. It was part of a sophisticated contingency strategy developed by Confederate leadership as they faced increasingly likely defeat. The documents found in the chamber had already begun to reshape historical understanding of the Confederacy's final months. Letters between Treasury officials and military commanders revealed complex plans for continuing resistance even after the fall of Richmond, with financial resources strategically positioned to support what they hoped would be a long-term insurgency against Union control. These documents show that key Confederate leaders were thinking beyond conventional military defeat. Thomas Greene observed during one of the regular Thursday gatherings at Ruby's Diner, which had now become a de facto seminar on Willow Creek's historical significance. They were preparing for what we might today call an asymmetric conflict, using hidden resources to fund continued resistance indefinitely. For Maxwell, these historical insights provided a deeper context for his great-great-grandfather's sacrifice. Lieutenant Samuel Fletcher hadn't just died in one of countless Civil War skirmishes. He had played a direct role in preventing the Confederacy from implementing its plans for sustained post-war resistance. The gold that might have funded years of continued bloodshed had instead remained hidden for over a century and a half, only to be discovered by his descendant. The poetic justice of this historical arc wasn't lost on the media, which continued to cover the Willow Creek discovery with unprecedented attention. Maxwell found himself profiled in publications ranging from historical journals to veterans magazines. His journey from wounded warrior to battlefield caretaker to historical discoverer presented as an inspirational American narrative. A particularly moving piece in National Geographic connected Maxwell's military service in Afghanistan with his great-grandfather's Civil War experience, exploring how both men had demonstrated remarkable courage in conflict zones separated by 150 years and thousands of miles. The article included side-by-side photographs, a formal portrait of Lieutenant Fletcher in his Union uniform, and a recent image of Sergeant Fletcher in modern combat gear, highlighting the physical resemblance that spanned 5 generations. As media interest intensified, Maxwell remained grounded by his daily work at Willow Creek. While the legal negotiations and historical research continued, he maintained his focus on preserving and understanding the battlefield itself. Each morning began with a walk across the property, checking fences, noting areas that needed attention, and simply absorbing the peaceful beauty of this land where so much history had unfolded. During one such morning walk, approximately 3 weeks after the discovery, Maxwell found himself in the northwestern corner of the property, an area far from the excavation site that had received little attention during the recent excitement. As he crested a small rise, he noticed something unusual, a rectangular depression in the ground, approximately 6 feet by 3 feet, with vegetation growing in a slightly different pattern than the surrounding area. Maxwell's training immediately recognized the dimensions, the standard size of a grave. The location, well away from the known battlefield burial sites that had been documented and moved to official cemeteries after the war, suggested this might be an undiscovered soldier's final resting place. He marked the location and immediately contacted Dr. Montgomery, who arranged for ground-penetrating radar to examine the site without disturbing what might be a grave. The results confirmed Maxwell's suspicion. The radar revealed the unmistakable outline of human remains approximately 3 feet below the surface, along with what appeared to be metal objects consistent with military equipment. Based on the location and what we're seeing in the radar images, this appears to be a solitary burial, possibly of an officer, Dr. Montgomery explained when she reviewed the findings with Maxwell. The fact that it's isolated from the main battlefield burial areas suggests it might have been someone significant who was given a separate interment. The discovery of the potential grave added yet another dimension to Willow Creek's historical significance. If this was indeed the final resting place of the Civil War soldier who had somehow been missed during the post-war reinterment efforts, proper identification and either preservation or relocation would be required. Authorization for a careful archaeological excavation was obtained through the appropriate historical and legal channels, with representatives from both Union and Confederate heritage organizations present to ensure proper protocols were followed. As the excavation proceeded, evidence quickly confirmed that this was indeed a Civil War-era military burial. The remains were those of a man in his 30s, dressed in the remnants of what was clearly an officer's uniform. Buttons and insignia identified him as a Confederate captain, while personal effects included a pocket watch, a signet ring, and most significantly, a leather wallet containing waterproofed papers that had remarkably survived the passage of time. Among these papers was an identification card bearing the name Captain James Thornton, 7th Virginia Cavalry, CSA, and a handwritten letter addressed to his wife in Richmond. The letter, dated February 16, 1865, the day before the Battle of Willow Creek, provided an extraordinary historical connection to the gold discovery. "My dearest Margaret," the letter began, "tomorrow we face a significant engagement that may determine the fate of the special shipment entrusted to our protection. I pray for victory, but if God wills otherwise, know that I have taken precautions. The location of our contingency storage is recorded in my official dispatch to the Treasury Department, coded according to our established protocol. Should our lines be overrun, this information will ensure the resources remain secure until they can be recovered for our cause." The letter continued with personal messages to his wife and children, but this opening paragraph established a direct connection between Captain Thornton and the Confederate gold shipment. Historical records quickly confirmed that Thornton had been the officer in charge of the military escort protecting the Treasury shipment, and his previously unknown grave had remained hidden on the battlefield where he had fallen while defending that precious cargo. "This is an extraordinary historical connection," Dr. Montgomery explained as they carefully preserved the letter. "Captain Thornton was directly responsible for the gold shipment, and his grave has remained undisturbed less than half a mile from the underground chamber where that shipment was hidden. It's as if Willow Creek has been protecting these secrets together for over 150 years." The discovery of Captain Thornton's grave and his letter provided the final piece of the historical puzzle. The narrative was now complete. Confederate Treasury officials had dispatched a significant gold shipment to fund continued resistance. Captain Thornton's cavalry unit had been assigned to protect it. When Union forces led by Lieutenant Fletcher threatened to capture the shipment, the gold had been secured in the pre-prepared underground chamber, and both Thornton and Fletcher had died in the subsequent battle, their blood soaking into the Virginia soil while the treasure remained hidden. Now 5 generations later, Lieutenant Fletcher's descendant had discovered both the gold and the grave of the man who had hidden it, bringing closure to one of the Civil War's enduring mysteries. The historical symmetry of these discoveries created a profound sense of purpose for Maxwell. What had begun as an unexpected inheritance and financial burden had evolved into something approaching a historical calling. He was not merely the accidental beneficiary of a treasure find, but the person uniquely positioned by family history, military experience, and personal circumstance to bring this chapter of American history into the light. As the legal negotiations progressed toward their conclusion, Maxwell worked with historians, museum curators, and education specialists to develop a comprehensive plan for Willow Creek's future. The battlefield would become not just a preserved historical site, but an educational center exploring multiple dimensions of Civil War history, military tactics, economic factors, personal experiences of soldiers on both sides, and the war's complex legacy in American society. The discovery of the Confederate gold would be a central element of this educational narrative, but within a broader context that examined the economic dimensions of the Civil War and the Confederacy's financial strategies. Captain Thornton's grave would be properly marked and preserved, his personal items displayed alongside his letter and information about his role in the gold shipment's journey. Most importantly to Maxwell, his great-great-grandfather's service would be commemorated with a permanent exhibition exploring Lieutenant Fletcher's life, his sacrifice at Willow Creek, and the remarkable historical connection between his actions in 1865 and his descendants' discovery in the present day. 4 months after the initial discovery, the final legal agreements were signed in a ceremony at the Virginia State Capitol in Richmond. Maxwell, accompanied by Catherine Lawson, representatives from various historical organizations, and members of the Thursday Morning History Group from Ruby's Diner, formalized the arrangements that would secure both his personal future and Willow Creek's historical legacy. The financial terms remained as initially negotiated. Maxwell would receive approximately $36 million, representing 45% of the gold and silver's value. The funds would be placed in a trust structured to provide both immediate resources for developing the historical site and long-term financial security for its maintenance, and Maxwell's position as director. The historical artifacts would be preserved as a unified collection, with different components rotating between major museums, while always remaining identified as the Willow Creek discovery. Maxwell would retain technical ownership while ensuring public access through long-term institutional partnerships. The underground chamber itself would be carefully preserved and eventually open for limited public tours as part of the battlefield's educational programming. As Maxwell signed the final documents, he felt the weight of both history and future responsibility. The struggling veteran who had inherited a seemingly burdensome property less than a year earlier was now signing agreements worth millions of dollars and establishing a historical preservation framework that would likely endure for generations. "Your uncle would be so proud," Eleanor Whitfield whispered as she watched the signing ceremony. "He spent his life trying to preserve this history, and now you've not only continued that work, but elevated it beyond anything he could have imagined." The weeks following the agreement signing brought practical transformations to both Maxwell's life and Willow Creek Battlefield. The first installment of funds from the trust allowed him to begin essential improvements to the property, repairing the farmhouse, upgrading security systems, and developing initial visitor facilities that would eventually grow into a proper educational center. Maxwell also made a personal priority of reaching out to veterans organizations, establishing a program that would provide employment opportunities at Willow Creek for former military personnel struggling with the transition to civilian life. His own experience had taught him the challenges of that transition, and he was determined to create a workplace where military skills and experiences would be valued, and where the camaraderie of service could be partially recreated in a civilian context. Military service teaches attention to detail, respect for history, and a sense of belonging to something larger than yourself. Maxwell explained when interviewed about the Veterans Program. Those are exactly the qualities needed for preserving and sharing a historical site like Willow Creek. This isn't charity, it's matching the right people with the right mission. The first 3 veterans hired under this program brought diverse skills: a former Army engineer who supervised improvements to the property's infrastructure, a Navy veteran with administrative experience who managed the increasing paperwork associated with the site's new status, and a Marine who had served as a combat correspondent and now handled media relations and initial visitor information services. Working with these fellow veterans provided Maxwell with a renewed sense of the brotherhood he had known in the military. Their shared experiences created an immediate bond, and their understanding of military history brought valuable perspectives to the development of Willow Creek's educational programming. The archaeological work continued alongside these practical developments, with new discoveries emerging regularly as researchers analyzed the documents and artifacts from the underground chamber. One particularly significant find was a coded message from Confederate Secretary of State Judah P. Benjamin to diplomatic representatives in Europe, outlining plans for establishing a government in exile should Richmond fall and the conventional military conflict end in defeat. This document transforms our understanding of Confederate leadership's thinking in early 1865, explained a historian from the University of Virginia who had been granted early access to the archives. They weren't simply fighting a conventional war to the bitter end. They were developing sophisticated contingency plans for continuing their cause through political, financial, and potentially insurgent means if military defeat became inevitable. Such historical insights provided a deeper context for understanding why the gold shipment had been so important, and why such elaborate measures had been taken to conceal it when capture seemed imminent. The treasure hadn't been merely financial, it had represented the Confederacy's hope for continued existence in some form, even after conventional military defeat. 6 months after the discovery, Willow Creek Battlefield welcomed its first official visitors under its new status as a National Historic Landmark. The initial tours were limited to scheduled groups while facilities were still being developed, but the response exceeded all expectations. Historical societies, school groups, Civil War enthusiasts, and military organizations requested bookings months in advance, eager to see firsthand the site of what was now being called the most significant Civil War discovery of the 21st century. Maxwell insisted on leading many of these initial tours himself, feeling that his personal connection to both the battlefield's history and its remarkable discovery created a narrative that enhanced visitors' understanding. Walking groups across the property, pointing out key locations, and sharing the intertwined stories of Lieutenant Fletcher and Captain Thornton, he found a new purpose that combined his military experience, his family heritage, and his growing expertise in Civil War history. What makes Willow Creek unique, he would explain to visitors as they stood overlooking the battlefield, is that it's not just about a battle, or even about the remarkable treasure that remained hidden here for over 150 years. It's about how history connects across generations, and how the actions of individuals, like my great-great-grandfather charging Confederate positions or Captain Thornton protecting his assigned shipment, can have consequences that echo through time in ways they could never have imagined. The personal transformation that accompanied Maxwell's historical discovery was perhaps as remarkable as the find itself. The wounded veteran who had struggled with purpose and direction after leaving the military had found a mission that honored his family legacy, utilized his military training, and contributed to broader historical understanding. The financial security provided by the treasure discovery had removed the immediate pressures that had once threatened to force him to sell the property, but it was the sense of purpose rather than the money that had truly transformed his life. People focus on the gold, Maxwell observed during an interview with a military veterans magazine. And yes, its discovery has changed my financial situation dramatically. But the real treasure I found at Willow Creek was purpose, a mission. That connects my family's past with a meaningful future and allows me to create something that will outlast me. This perspective resonated particularly strongly with other veterans, many of whom struggled with similar challenges of finding meaningful civilian purpose after the intense mission focus of military service. Maxwell began receiving letters from former service members across the country, sharing their own stories of searching for meaning and purpose after leaving the structured environment of the armed forces. Recognizing the power of this connection, Maxwell expanded the Veterans Program at Willow Creek, creating additional positions and developing a formal internship structure that would allow veterans to gain experience in historical preservation, education, and site management. The program quickly gained national attention as a model for how historical sites could simultaneously serve educational purposes and provide meaningful transitions for former military personnel. 9 months after the discovery, as Willow Creek prepared for its formal grand opening as a fully developed historical site, Maxwell received an unexpected visitor. A tall, distinguished man in his 70s arrived without appointment, asking to speak with the soldier who found the Confederate gold. When Maxwell introduced himself, the visitor extended his hand with emotional intensity. "I'm Robert Thornton," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Captain James Thornton was my great-great-grandfather. When I read about your discovery of his grave and the letter to my great-grandmother, I knew I had to come see this place for myself." The meeting between descendants of Captain Thornton and Lieutenant Fletcher, adversaries who had died on opposite sides of the Battle of Willow Creek, created an extraordinary moment of historical reconciliation. Robert Thornton had brought family documents and photographs that added personal dimensions to the historical record, including a portrait of Captain Thornton in his Confederate uniform that matched the insignia found on the body in the grave. "My family never knew what happened to him," Robert explained as they walked the battlefield together. "His name was on the official casualty lists, but his body was never recovered and returned to Richmond. For generations, his final resting place remained a mystery until your discovery." The connection between these two men, descendants of opposing soldiers whose actions had directly influenced the fate of the Confederate gold, represented a powerful symbol of historical reconciliation. Their ancestors had faced each other as enemies across battle lines, but their descendants now walked together, sharing a commitment to understanding and preserving the complex history they had both inherited. "Would you consider joining our historical advisory board?" Maxwell asked as they stood beside Captain Thornton's now properly marked grave. Having perspectives from descendants of both Union and Confederate soldiers involved in this battle would add immeasurable depth to our educational mission. Robert Thornton agreed immediately, and this unexpected partnership became another chapter in Willow Creek's evolving narrative, a story of how historical discovery could bridge not only generations, but the divisions that had once driven Americans to fight against one another in the nation's bloodiest conflict. As the first anniversary of Maxwell's inheritance of Willow Creek approached, the transformation of both the property and his life had exceeded anything he could have imagined when he first received news of his uncle's bequest. The struggling veteran facing financial ruin had become the director of a nationally recognized historical site, financially secure and engaged in work that honored both his family legacy and his military service. The southeastern corner of the property, once mysteriously avoided by wildlife and the source of local legends, now featured a carefully preserved archaeological site where visitors could view the entrance to the underground chamber and displays, explaining its historical significance. Captain Thornton's grave in the northwestern corner had been properly marked and incorporated into the battlefield tour, creating a physical connection between the man who had hidden the gold and the location, where it had remained concealed for generations. Most meaningful to Maxwell was the memorial to Lieutenant Samuel Fletcher, carefully positioned at the spot where historical records indicated he had led the charge against Confederate positions. The memorial included not only information about his military service and sacrifice, but also the remarkable connection between his actions in 1865 and his descendants' discovery more than a century and a half later. Standing before this memorial on the anniversary of his inheritance, Maxwell reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past year. He had arrived at Willow Creek, a wounded warrior, struggling with physical and psychological scars from his service in Afghanistan, uncertain of his future, and burdened by what had seemed a financially unsustainable inheritance. Now he stood as the steward of an important piece of American history, engaged in work that honored his ancestors' sacrifice, while creating opportunities for fellow veterans to find their own post-military purpose. The gold discovery had provided financial security, but the true treasure he had found at Willow Creek was something far more valuable, a mission that connected past and future, that utilized his military training for peaceful historical preservation, and that allowed him to transform an inheritance that had once seemed a burden into a legacy that would endure for generations. As visitors began arriving for the day's tours, Maxwell straightened his shoulders and prepared to share once again the remarkable story of Willow Creek Battlefield, a narrative of sacrifice, hidden treasure, and historical connection that had waited more than 150 years to be told, until a wounded warrior returned from a modern war had the courage and perseverance to uncover secrets that had remained buried beneath his feet. 5 years after the remarkable discovery that had transformed Willow Creek Battlefield into a nationally recognized historical site, Maxwell Fletcher stood at the podium in the newly completed Education Center, preparing to address a special audience. The center's grand opening ceremony had drawn historians, government officials, and media representatives from across the country. But the group that meant most to Maxwell sat in the front row's 30 veterans currently participating in Willow Creek's rehabilitation and transition program. When I inherited this battlefield 6 years ago, Maxwell began, his voice steady and confident in a way that still sometimes surprised him. I was a broken soldier with more wounds inside than out. I had no direction, no purpose, and frankly, no hope. He paused, looking directly at the veterans before him. I know that feeling intimately, the sense that the skills that kept you alive in combat have no place in civilian life, that the brotherhood of service can never be replaced, that the intensity of purpose you once felt is gone forever. Maxwell gestured to the sweeping windows behind him, which framed a perfect view of the rolling Virginia countryside where Union and Confederate soldiers had once fought and died. What I discovered here, and I'm not talking about $80 million, in Confederate gold, was that purpose doesn't end when you take off the uniform. Sometimes it just takes a different form, when you might never have expected. The Willow Creek Veterans Program had become Maxwell's proudest achievement, far surpassing the fame of the gold discovery itself. What had begun as a small initiative to provide employment for former military personnel had evolved into a comprehensive transition program that combined meaningful work in historical preservation with specialized counseling, career development, and peer support for veterans struggling with the return to civilian life. Today, as we officially open this education center, we're not just celebrating a building or even the remarkable history it commemorates, Maxwell continued. We're celebrating the living legacy of service that connects the soldiers who fought here in 1865 with those who have served our nation in the generations since. We're celebrating the discovery that our greatest challenges can sometimes lead to our most meaningful contributions. The journey from that first gold discovery to this moment had been extraordinary by any measure. The financial aspects had been resolved largely as outlined in the initial agreement, with Maxwell receiving approximately $36 million for his share of the treasure. Rather than using these funds primarily for personal benefit, he had established the Fletcher Foundation, which supported both the development of Willow Creek and a range of veterans programs across the country. The historical significance of The find had only grown as researchers continued to analyze the documents recovered from the underground chamber. Historians now recognize the Willow Creek discovery as providing critical insights into the Confederacy's final strategies and contingency planning. Several books and documentary films had explored different aspects of the find, from the military history of the battle to the economic implications of the Confederate financial planning revealed in the Treasury documents. Maxwell had become a sought-after speaker at historical conferences, veterans events, and educational institutions, sharing not just the story of the discovery but the deeper narrative of finding purpose through connecting with history. His journey from wounded warrior to accidental historian to director of an innovative veterans program resonated with audiences far beyond those interested in Civil War history. The education center that was being dedicated today represented the physical culmination of Maxwell's vision for Willow Creek. The striking modern building, constructed with materials that complemented the historic landscape, housed exhibition spaces, research facilities, classrooms, and administrative offices for the growing staff. Its design had been recognized with architectural awards for successfully blending contemporary functionality with respect for the historic setting. Inside, carefully designed exhibitions told the multi-layered story of Willow Creek, the military history of the battle, the economic context of the Confederate gold shipment, the personal stories of soldiers like Lieutenant Fletcher and Captain Thornton, and the remarkable modern discovery that had brought these historical threads together. A special gallery was dedicated to the underground chamber itself, with a detailed reconstruction and original artifacts displayed in museum-quality cases. But for Maxwell, the heart of the center was not the public exhibition spaces, but the Veterans Wing, a specially designed area where former military personnel could find both employment and healing through engagement with history. This section included workshops where veterans learned conservation techniques for historical artifacts, research spaces where they contributed to ongoing historical documentation, and gathering areas where they found the camaraderie that many had missed since leaving military service. The gold discovery made headlines, Maxwell told his audience, but what we've built here together goes far deeper than buried treasure. We've created a place where history lives not just in artifacts and documents, but in the connections between generations of those who have served, from Lieutenant Samuel Fletcher and Captain James Thornton to every veteran who finds a new mission here today. The Fletcher-Thornton partnership, as it had come to be known, had evolved into one of the most remarkable aspects of Willow Creek's development. What had begun with that unexpected visit from Robert Thornton, Captain Thornton's great-great-grandson, had grown into a formal collaboration between the descendants of opposing Civil War soldiers. Robert Thornton had become a key member of the Historical Advisory Board, bringing not only his family connection but his professional expertise as a retired history professor. His perspective as a descendant of a Confederate officer provided essential balance to the site's historical interpretation, ensuring that the complex motivations and experiences of soldiers on both sides were presented with nuance and respect. Together, Maxwell and Robert had developed educational programs that used Willow Creek's unique history to explore themes of conflict, reconciliation, and shared heritage. School groups from across the country now visited the battlefield to learn, not just about the Civil War itself, but about how historical understanding could bridge divisions that once seemed insurmountable. Robert and I often reflect on what our great-great-grandfathers would think if they could see us working together, Maxwell said, acknowledging the elderly historian who sat in the front row. Two men who faced each other as enemies across this battlefield now have descendants who have become partners and friends in preserving their shared history. That transformation may be as valuable as any gold we uncovered. The archaeological work at Willow Creek had continued long after the initial excitement of the gold discovery, revealing new dimensions of the site's history with each season's careful excavation. 3 years earlier, Archaeologists had uncovered the remains of a field hospital approximately 400 yards from Captain Thornton's grave, providing new insights into medical practices during the battle and recovering artifacts that added texture to the historical narrative. More surprising had been the discovery, just last year, of a second underground chamber near the southeastern corner of the property. Smaller than the main treasury facility and apparently constructed with less care, this second chamber had contained a cache of personal items belonging to Confederate soldiers' letters, photographs, small valuables, and journals that they had, apparently hidden for safekeeping before the battle, perhaps intending to retrieve them afterward. These intensely personal artifacts had provided an emotional counterpoint to the official treasury documents in gold, reminding visitors that beyond the strategic military operations and financial considerations, the Civil War had been fought by individual human beings with hopes, fears, and connections to loved ones they had left behind. One journal in particular had captured public imagination when excerpts were published in historical journals. Written by a young Confederate lieutenant named William Hargrove, it contained not just accounts of military movements, but deeply reflective passages about the author's growing doubts regarding the Confederate cause and his hopes for reconciliation. If he survived the conflict, I fight now more for the men beside me than for the cause that once seemed so clear, Hargrove had written just days before the Battle of Willow Creek, where records indicated he had been killed. If God grants me life beyond this war, I pray for the wisdom to help heal the nation that we have torn asunder. These words, written by a soldier who did not survive to see peace restored, had become incorporated into Willow Creek's educational materials, providing a powerful example of how individuals could experience moral growth, even amid the brutal realities of warfare. For the veterans who worked at the site, Lieutenant Hargrove's reflections often resonated with their own complex feelings about their military service and its purpose. History is not just about grand strategies and famous leaders, Maxwell continued in his address. It's about individual human beings making choices in difficult circumstances, finding courage in moments of fear, and sometimes discovering wisdom through suffering. That's as true for a soldier in Afghanistan today as it was for the men who fought here in 1865. The Veterans Program had grown beyond Maxwell's initial vision, now including specialized tracks for different career paths within historical preservation and education. Veterans with engineering backgrounds worked on infrastructure preservation and site development. Those with teaching experience or interest developed and led educational programs. Others with technical skills learned specialized conservation techniques for artifacts and documents. Most innovative was the archaeological training program, which had emerged from the observation that veterans often possessed ideal skills for careful excavation work, attention to detail, patience with methodical procedures, and respect for protocols that ensured site integrity. Under Dr. Montgomery's guidance, veterans received professional training in archaeological techniques, with many going on to work at other historical sites or pursue formal education in the field. The skills that make a good soldier: discipline, attention to detail, respect for established procedures, awareness of your surroundings, make an excellent archaeologist or conservator, Maxwell explained. We're not asking veterans to become something entirely new, but to redirect abilities they already possess toward preserving history rather than making it. The program had achieved remarkable success rates, with over 80% of participating veterans successfully transitioning to long-term employment, either at Willow Creek or at other historical sites and museums across the country. The psychological benefits proved equally significant, with participants reporting reduced symptoms of post-traumatic stress, increased sense of purpose, and stronger social connections. When I first came here, said James Wilson, a former Marine who now supervised the artifact conservation workshop, I couldn't sleep through the night, couldn't maintain relationships, couldn't see any future for myself. Working with these historical Artifacts touching objects that connect us to people who lived and fought generations ago somehow helped me place my own experiences in perspective. I started to see my military service as part of a larger continuum, rather than a disconnected trauma that defined me. This psychological dimension had become a formal component of the program, with licensed counselors specializing in veterans' issues working alongside the historical staff. Rather than traditional therapy settings, counseling often occurred while walking the battlefield or working with artifacts, creating natural opportunities for veterans to process their experiences within the context of historical perspective. Standing where my great-great-grandfather fought helps me understand my own service, Maxwell told his audience. Not because the circumstances were the same, they weren't, but because I can see how individual sacrifice fits into a larger historical narrative that extends beyond any single lifetime. That perspective doesn't erase the challenges of military service, but it can help make them bearable. The Education Center's dedication ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a special exhibition titled Generations of Service, which traced the military history of the Fletcher family from Lieutenant Samuel Fletcher's Civil War service through Maxwell's deployment in Afghanistan. Photographs, letters, medals, and personal items from each generation created a visual timeline of American military history as experienced by one family. This exhibition isn't about glorifying war, Maxwell explained as he guided special guests through the gallery. It's about honoring the individuals who serve and recognizing how their experiences echo across generations. My great-grandfather in World War I, my grandfather in World War II, my father in Vietnam, and my own service in Afghanistan. Each of us faced different conflicts, but shared experiences that transcend time. The centerpiece of the exhibition was a striking display that juxtaposed Lieutenant Fletcher's Civil War uniform with Maxwell's modern combat gear, visually demonstrating both how much had changed in military equipment and how much remained consistent in the human experience of warfare. Between these uniforms stood a glass case containing the metal detector that had led to the gold discovery, symbolizing the connection between past and present that had transformed Willow Creek and Maxwell's life. Following the formal ceremony, Maxwell hosted a more private gathering for the veterans and their families in the center's community space. Here, away from official speeches and media attention, he spoke more personally about his own journey from wounded warrior to accidental historian to program director. When I inherited this battlefield, I was at the lowest point of my life, he told the group. The physical wounds were healing, but inside I was lost. I couldn't see how anything I'd learned in the military could possibly matter in civilian life. I felt discarded, irrelevant, and completely alone. He described the gradual process of reconnection that had begun with exploring the battlefield, researching its history, and eventually discovering the hidden chamber that had contained the Confederate Treasury shipment. The gold made headlines, but the real discovery was purpose, finding something that mattered, something I could contribute to, something that would outlast me. For many of the veterans in the program, Maxwell's story provided a template for their own transitions. They saw in him not a miraculous success story, but a fellow soldier who had struggled, persevered, and eventually found a new mission that honored his military service while creating meaning in civilian life. What we're doing here isn't just about preserving the past, Maxwell concluded. It's about building a future where military service is understood as part of a continuum of contribution that can take different forms throughout a lifetime. The skills, the discipline, the commitment to something larger than yourself, these don't disappear when you take off the uniform. They just need a new mission to serve. As the gathering continued into the evening, with veterans and their families sharing stories and building connections, Maxwell stepped outside onto the center's terrace for a moment of quiet reflection. The setting sun cast long shadows across Willow Creek Battlefield, painting the rolling Virginia landscape in gold and amber hues that echoed the treasure that had been hidden beneath its surface for generations. From this vantage point, he could see the key locations that had defined both the historical battle and his own journey of discovery. The southeastern corner, where his metal detector had first registered the presence of the underground chamber. The site of Captain Thornton's grave, and the ridge where Lieutenant Samuel Fletcher had led the charge that ultimately prevented the Confederate gold from reaching its destination. Maxwell thought about the parallel journeys that had unfolded across time on this land, his great-grandfather traveling from his Pennsylvania home to fight for the Union, Captain Thornton escorting the Treasury shipment from Richmond, and Maxwell himself arriving as a wounded veteran seeking to escape financial ruin through an unexpected inheritance. None of them could have anticipated how their paths would intersect across generations, or how their individual actions would resonate through time. The gold discovery had transformed Maxwell's life in ways that went far beyond financial security. It had given him purpose when he needed it most, connected him to his family's history in profound and unexpected ways, and ultimately provided the foundation for creating a program that now helped other veterans find their own paths forward. As darkness fell and lights began to illuminate the education center behind him, Maxwell felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought him to this moment. The wounded soldier who had arrived at Willow Creek 6 years earlier, uncertain of his future and burdened by his past, could never have imagined standing here as the director of a nationally recognized historical site and veterans program. "Lieutenant Fletcher," he said quietly, addressing his ancestor across the generations, "I hope we've done right by your sacrifice. The battle you fought here ended long ago, but its echoes have created something that continues to serve." Maxwell turned back toward the center, where veterans and their families were gathered in community, finding healing through connection with each other and with history. Tomorrow would bring more visitors eager to learn about the Battle of Willow Creek and the remarkable discovery of the Confederate gold. More veterans would arrive seeking new purpose after military service. Researchers would continue analyzing the historical documents that were still yielding new insights into the Civil War's final months. The treasure that had remained hidden beneath Willow Creek Battlefield for more than 150 years had finally fulfilled its purpose, not as Confederate funding for continued resistance, as originally intended, but as the catalyst for a different kind of legacy. The gold bars themselves now resided primarily in museums and secure vaults, but their discovery had created something far more valuable, a place where history lived not just in artifacts and exhibitions, but in the renewed sense of purpose it offered to those who had served their country across generations. As Maxwell rejoined the gathering inside, a young veteran approached him with the mixture of respect and camaraderie that characterized relationships in the program. "Sir," she said, "I just wanted to thank you. When I came here 3 months ago, I didn't think anyone could possibly understand what I was going through. But this place what you've built here, it's given me hope that there's a way forward." Maxwell smiled, recognizing in her eyes the same mixture of pain and potential that he had once carried. "That's the real treasure of Willow Creek," he replied, "not what we found buried in the ground, but what we build together above it." The education center at Willow Creek Battlefield would close to visitors that evening, but its lights would remain on late into the night as veterans continued sharing their stories, finding connections, and building a community that bridged the divide between military service and civilian life. Outside, under a canopy of stars that had witnessed centuries of human struggle and triumph on this land, the battlefield rested in peaceful darkness, its secrets revealed, but its power to transform lives still unfolding with each passing day. The treasure that had once been intended to fund continued conflict had instead become the foundation for healing and reconciliation across the divisions of Civil War history, across the gap between military and civilian life, and across the generations that connected Lieutenant Samuel Fletcher to his great-grandson who had finally completed the mission that began on this battlefield more than a century and a half before. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.